I think that's really very important. So now we're going to go into our Q&A section, and I have a number of questions that have been submitted earlier, and quite a few have come in during our time online here. So I'll just put these out. Of course, the majority of these and that you've sent in as viewers, they fall within the health and the science area. A number of these have already been answered, so I'm not necessarily going to be asking those again. So hopefully you've had your answers to those. But let me start with this one. You were just talking about the ingredients, actually, Dr. Cassiano. Are you satisfied with the long-term safety of the vaccines?
So far, in about a year of vaccine administration, and Dr. Langles alluded to the number of doses that have been administered. It has been about a year so far, and there is very little evidence of long-term effects of the components of the vaccine. The components that people object more to are three of them: the messenger RNA, the lipid nanoparticles, and the trometamine. The messenger RNA, people are a little bit fearful about it because there is this misconception that this messenger RNA will alter our DNA because it's going to incorporate into our genetic material. Messenger RNA does not incorporate into our genetic material. It's biologically impossible. What the messenger RNA does is that it stays in the cytoplasm of the cell, the ribosomes, which are protein-making machines that we have in the cytoplasm, take that messenger RNA and convert that, translate it into proteins. Those are spike proteins that are then secreted. Those spike proteins by themselves, they don't do anything to our body that could be damaging. The virus with the spike proteins, yes, that can be damaging, but the spike proteins by themselves are not damaging without the virus. So that's a misconception that people think that this messenger RNA is going to change our genetic material. It won't. There is no evidence for that. The other concern is the lipid nanoparticles. These nanoparticles are made of polyethylene glycol, which is used in a lot of materials that we have in our kitchen. How many of you like to do baking bread or baking pastries? Well, it's very likely that some of the components that you use in your recipe have polyethylene glycol on it. If you drink a soda, non-caffeinated soda, let's say, it has polyethylene glycol. So there's a lot of things that we do, that we take, that have polyethylene glycol. Some of the spices, the powder spices that we put in when cooking, have polyethylene glycol. Is not associated, at those trace amount, is not associated with any disease. And the third component is trometamine. Trometamine is an acid stabilizer that in some people with acidosis is given to them to stabilize the acidosis. The amount of trometamine that is present in the vaccines is just traces of the amount that is used for treating acidosis. Now, we may object of having traces of trometamine, but did you know that about 400 to 500 of the cosmetics and the creams that we use for our face and for washing have trometamine on them? Over 400. But these are traces just to stabilize the pH. So traces amount of trometamine have been proven to be safe. Large amounts that are used for clinical uses for pH stabilizing, those may have side effects, but those amounts are not present in the vaccines.
Okay, because somebody also wrote in a question about actually tromethamine, that it's been added to the Pfizer vaccine for children. So you're saying that the small amounts that are there are just for stabilizing it, but they're not harmful.
Yeah, that's what the evidence says so far. And again, we have to go by the scientific evidence, by what has been published, by the clinical trials. So far, that's what the evidence. That it may change in the future, we don't know. Most likely not based on 1 year of research.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much. There's so much more we could get into there, but I'm just going to change it a little bit here. So somebody has been saying, are any of you aware of figures of, let's say, 600,000 people being injured by the vaccines that haven't been reported, and that these things are being silenced and kept under the carpet? Hundreds of thousands that are being adversely affected by vaccines.
The question that I have is, what is the source of that number? Where that number came from? Did it come from the medical literature, from the scientific literature? Because when there is an adverse effect from the vaccine, that has to be reported. And the question, those 600,000, are those injuries including chills and fever and pain in the arm? Or are we talking about more serious injuries? What is the source of that data? Where is that number coming from? Because I show the numbers of serious effect, mostly 1 in 20 million or in 100 million, depending on the effect, very low level. So there are a lot of figures that are being circulated in the internet, but the question that I have, what is the source of those numbers? What is the source of those figures? Are they based on what some people are saying, or are they based on clinical and medical published literature?
Yeah, and you're bringing up a very important point that maybe some of the others want to jump in on as well. How do we check the veracity of these claims that come out? Because, everybody has access to the internet. We can be going on there and finding all kinds of sources of different things. Some of the questions had links to them. I've been looking at those, and people are coming across saying all kinds of numbers. Are there some good principles that we could follow for how to be careful in the sources that we are believing in?
I think that one of the key components, and I just want to appreciate what each of the presenters has presented, but also a particular shout out to Dr. Cassiano on the importance of the science. The very last paper that he showed is the kind of evidence we need to be looking at, where there has been wide peer-reviewed. Now, the importance of the peer-reviewed component, and I didn't take a lot of time when I presented my portion of the symposium. Why do we talk about peer-reviewed evidence base? This is not something where I will say, you know what, I found in my experience, thus and so helps for whatever it may be. This is where rigid, robust studies have been done, where there has been a review process. And what's people can note, it's not always reported as widely on the internet as it should be, but there have been scientific papers which have been withdrawn, which have been rejected following acceptance, including recently on ivermectin, for example, because of improper use of statistics, inappropriate use of statistics, duplicate reporting, and inadequate sourcing of patient data. The 600,000 number also bears a certain relationship to the VAERS, the adverse events related reports on vaccine issues. I was vaccinated here in the United States, and I still receive on a periodic basis a text message which says, "Time for your health check-in." This is a check-in which is, you fill it in yourself. People who are lay people, who are not medical people, fill it in. It goes in, and those are reviewed. Now, so the numbers that have reported some sort of adverse event would be included in that, including those that Dr. Cassiano mentioned: pain at the site, itching, mild temperature, maybe severe temperature. Some people get severe tiredness. Some people feel very ill for a day or two after the vaccine or the booster. Those are all the things that have been recorded. These are subsequently analyzed and looked at for significance in the bigger picture. What has also been noted is that some of the data that has been submitted on the VAERS process was submitted after patients had died from some other cause. You know, as the studies have gone deeper into what is being reported. So some of the statistics which are being bandied around have no firm foundation. They have not been peer-reviewed. Now, when you look at the number of doses of vaccine which have been administered as being, I think, 9.6 billion at the latest count, around about. Surely we would have been seeing in institutions which are reputable and with whom we consult on a regular basis, where there are not only scientists who are committed and ethical, but who are Christians. Many of these we have dealt with personally, including people like Dr. Cassiano. I'm thinking of others at University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins, who give us very, very clear interpretations, not only interpretations of the data, but the insight into the data itself. So there are a lot of hyperbolic assessments going around which are unfounded. But looking at the bigger picture, with 9.6 billion doses given, I think it's inappropriate to call this yet an experimental vaccine, because the vaccines that have been developed for COVID-19 across the board, not only the mRNA vaccines, have had a lot of exposure, and a lot of exposure. You can't hide things today on the internet, nor should we want to. And that's a beneficial effect. So there's been a lot of exaggeration, a lot of wrenching out of context, creating an impression that should not be there. We need to be careful. We need to be cautious. We need to rightly divide all of this information appropriately. And Dr. Cassiano has done that very well today.
Yes, Ganun Diop, yes. Just unmute and...
Sorry. Yes, I would like just to add, I think, a very appropriate biblical advice. In 1 Thessalonians 5, the Apostle Paul says the following: examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good, and abstain from every form of evil. Examining, you know, we should not just believe what we hear or read. Not everything in the internet or any source of information is true. So I think what Dr. Cassiano mentioned, the idea of, foundationally, the source. Where does it come from, what we are hearing? And then Dr. Lanles mentioned this idea now, not only the source, but also peer-reviewed, scientific, credible information. I think that is extremely important. In other words, here, in a positive thing, in a positive sense, we are invited to be mature thinkers, basically critical thinkers. I think this is extremely important before making inferences, right? We ought to know what are the premises. Where does it come from? This is just part of logic. It's part of thinking correctly. And this is really vital and important. Otherwise, we will be victim of all kinds of conspiracy theories, and I think God has graced us with intelligence, mind, thinking faculties that will help us distinguish, make a difference. And in our post-truth world, which has been, labeled as such, it is even more important for us to be careful thinkers, discerning people, wise persons, basically.
Thank you for adding that, because, sometimes just as lay people, because we're getting so much coming our way, both from scientists and everybody else, it's almost like you have to be an expert yourself. And some of us just have to give up and say, ask a friend, what are you doing? And what sources are you getting? Because it just seems so overwhelming. I mean, we already have to deal with the lockdown, etc. And then having to do a lot of this thinking can seem overwhelming. But I agree with you, Dr. Diop, that we've got to, we're being forced to think and make our decision. Jennifer Woods.
I was going to say, just to add to that, I know for myself, I see people post things on Facebook and people take it as fact. And oftentimes we'll see people with certain, letters before their name. And so because they have the doctor before their name or the PhD after their name, we think, oh, they're a credible source. But that does not mean that someone is an expert in the area of immunology and COVID-19. And so we have to be very careful about, again, who we trust as our source of information, and not all sources are created equal, but there's a very loud minority of conspiracy theorists out there that are promulgating information, and people are just taking it in and then sharing it, and it becomes fact for many of us. And so we have to be very careful about that.
Yes. Well, one of the questions that came in was to do with we as a church, do we feel uncomfortable with the fact that it seems as if governments are using manipulation, censorship, threatening job loss, etc., to enforce vaccination on people? As it says in the question, is this the mindset of a loving God or the mindset of the evil one? How would you address that one? It has been talked a little, yes.
Well, if you just, the idea of check and balances, I think, is a good one to remember. And I think I mentioned in my presentation the distinction between an absolute right, like the internal aspect of religious freedom. Nobody has the right to impose upon anyone what to believe or what not to believe. So that is like the internal forum. No government can force, upon an individual what to believe or not to believe. Interestingly, and I mentioned this passing, but in 1888, it was the year when two bills were introduced in the U.S. government, the Senate, and it was Senator Blair from New Hampshire who proposed a bill for Sunday law, for example, and the second one was to make America a Christian nation. Now, interestingly, Adventists at the time were at the forefront to oppose, actually. Adventists even spoke to the Congress in order to oppose the bill. Why was that so? Well, precisely because the government has to be kept in check not to impose indiscriminately on people, right? And then impinge upon their rights. I think, yes, governments have to be held in check, no problem. But at the same time, the forum externum leaves space for a government, as I mentioned with the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, where under certain circumstances, for health reasons, public safety, the government can actually restrict some of the freedoms, such as the freedom of assembly, in order to protect people from spreading the virus, for example. But of course, we are in societies where conversation have to continue and questions have to be asked, and then also challenges to government and so forth. Again, but this is part of living in society, and that is part of our responsibility, of course, to engage government, but also to be lawful citizens, where it is justified.
Okay. So just to build, go ahead.
I'm just going to add one piece to that. And I think sometimes people have concerns about vaccination mandates and the government mandating or coercing people to do certain things because they see it as a slippery slope to the eventual government saying you can't worship on Sabbath or taking away other rights. But there's dangers with a slippery slope type of argument because there are many, many steps involved. And I think that if we use the rationale of, oh, this is going to lead to this one day, we're really making a lot of assumptions there that just aren't here yet. And as Dr. Diep said, and as I think said in my presentation as well, the government mandates all sorts of other things. They mandate, for example, the wearing of seatbelts. So, I mean, the government does have a role to play in protecting the public health. That does not automatically lead to the government taking away the right to worship on a certain day or taking away other rights.
But what about if that spills out into the church? Somebody did write, should COVID passes be mandatory for religious services? I mean, if it starts spilling out into the church and we're saying, non-vaccinated shouldn't come here, what about if it starts moving in that direction?
Well, I'm not going to address that very granular point, but what I would like to just confirm is that for the last 30 plus years, when I travel, I cannot enter places if I have not got a smallpox vaccine certificate. I may not, whether I can see here on religious duties, whether I'm there on scientific duties, whatever. I think this is an important point, and Attorney Woods mentioned this right at the beginning, that, and she mentioned it right now, there are mandates in place which are on a public health level, and safety belts, and non-smoking on airplanes. Seventh-day Adventists were in the forefront of having that enacted. And it's a law. It's mandated, punishable. I think that the religious liberty colleagues are going to have more fun with the answering the issue of mandating whether we can say something about being vaccinated, otherwise we can't meet publicly in church. I'd be happy to hear that.
Do we even have to go there? I think this is part of responsibility. I mean, many churches today, for example, would write protocol observed. So how would I go to a church with the risk that are actually pending? I mean, current, I should say, and endanger other people's life if I am a carrier. I mean, if I can infect people, that is irresponsibility. And I'm not saying this, like in a vindictive way, but I think we have to appeal to people's conscience and civility and actually care and love. It goes to that. We're not just saying love for the sake of, putting everything under one umbrella and so forth, but it's about caring about other people's safety. And again, a foundational principle among Adventists, if I may say, and beyond, is the right to life. and to save life and health and healing. And that would be inconsistent if I behave in a way to actually endanger other people's lives. It just doesn't make sense.
And a simple
But I think the other thing is that, during this pandemic, what I've seen, which troubles me in some ways, is that churches and religious institutions are asking for religious freedom to do things above and beyond what society is being asked to do, right? So we can close down other things, but don't close down our houses of worship, even though the public health concerns are the same for those gatherings. And I think in the question you posed of, if you're not vaccinated, you can't enter into this place. If it's being applied consistently, why should we ask for a special accommodation that's putting people at risk? And I think it goes back to Dr. Diop's point of, how is that showing love to those around us if we're willing to expose people to a highly, infectious communicable disease in the sake of religion?
And I think that's very clear, because the principle that's being enunciated is what Jesus said: love one another as I loved you, care for one another, be kind one to another. So this is not a new principle. The second thing is, and a simple guideline we have used since the beginning of the pandemic and in other settings around the world, is that in public health situations, we follow local jurisdictions, what they are recommending in that jurisdiction. And then, of course, we have our own choices, which we can then place within those mandates and within those jurisdictions. But during the height, and what we need to remember is that we are trying desperately to mitigate a pandemic. We lost the opportunity many months ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, the chance to isolate it. It didn't happen. So now where we are is we're at mitigation and working desperately to try and do that. And with all of the measures that have been put in place, which have cost dearly we don't only talk about the economic consequences, so importantly is what this has cost in human wellness and wholeness. Mental health issues, addictions have gone up, abuse has gone up, alcohol use has gone up. All of these issues have skyrocketed. Mental health concerns and problems have skyrocketed as well. So we're looking at a complex issue which needs to be brought under control. We shouldn't add fuel to that fire. We should rather work together in a way that we can help to bring things into a more manageable situation. And I think that is an appeal which I've heard clearly from the speakers today.
Thank you. Somebody has asked, actually, it's kind of a little bit related to what you were just saying there, Dr. Landless, about how effective are lockdowns? Because as some of the things you mentioned, things have been exacerbated, mental health issues, etc., abuse, etc., because of lockdowns. So are they effective? Someone is asking. Do we have to keep repeating them in order to contain something like this? Are the benefits of lockdown, do they outweigh the negatives? So, any thoughts on that?
Time alone is going to tell that. But one of the things that one does a lockdown for, one of the primary reasons, is because of the tremendous pressures placed on healthcare institutions in trying to cope with a new infectious disease. And what we have seen, and Dr. Cassiano pointed out, the Omicron virus is much more infectious and fortunately not as severe as Delta, because had it been, we would have been in huge trouble. Now, what would a lockdown do, or what do changes do in those settings? It presses down the curve. In other words, reduces the number of people that land up in hospital, that land up in ICUs. And that's also, and we need to understand this as we make our decisions, that immunization plays a very important role, along with what has been very clearly enunciated as natural immunity. that comes from being infected, but immunization is a useful tool. And we've seen it work in other diseases in the past, and I believe that we're seeing it work now. Again, clearly understanding what was enunciated in Dr. Cassiano's talk is that we need to have a clear understanding of what the immune system's about. It's not going to stop the infection, it's going to decrease the effects of an infectious agent and its consequences. And yes, the fact that boosters may be needed, absolutely. You don't get immunity from hepatitis A, B at least, with just one injection. You have to have 2, sometimes 3. And there are others. So, and those have been mentioned. So we need to realize there's a context to a lockdown, and it's the contents of the context of the circumstance. And we learn. One of the other issues, which is very, very key, is people saying, well, people don't know what they're talking about. They're changing guidelines every 5 minutes. This changes, that changes, isolation, quarantine time changes, the where to wear masks changes. Well, this is not an old disease, this particular one. And so as the science unfolds, as the data becomes available, so it's going to be that we learn what are the very best guidelines. And it's moving along trying to do that as well, which needs to be understood as we navigate these difficult waters.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to add to that. One of the reasons that the guidelines are being constantly modified is because the rapid pace of this disease changing.
Yeah.
Because of the numerous variants that are coming out. Every variant of the SARS-CoV virus is different from the previous one. It does different things. Who would have predicted that Omicron was going to come out of nowhere? What people were predicting was sub-variants of Delta, not a whole different variant coming with so many mutations. So every time we have a new variant, that variant alters the disease, how severe, how transmissible is this disease. Therefore, we need to adapt to that, because what we call this in virology viral evolution. This virus is rapidly changing. Therefore, we need to adapt to that. And we have to change the guidelines. We have to modify the guidelines and adapt accordingly.
There have been a couple of questions about testing, so Pcr tests and things like that. Are they really accurate for detecting whether or not you have the virus, etc.? Yeah, could you say something about testing?
There are 2 different tests. One is the PCR test, which is also called the molecular test. And that is the most accurate test, over 90% accuracy. And then there is the antigen test. What the antigen test detects is the presence of the virus in our body by looking for the presence of the spike protein. The antigen test is accurate, but more particularly after a few days of infection. Early during the infection, we don't have high viral loads. So the amount of virus that we have in our body early in the infection may not be sufficient enough to detect that spike protein or that antigen through that test. However, as the disease progresses and we have a higher amount of virus, a higher viral load, then the antigen test, the rapid antigen test, becomes more accurate. So early on, the rapid antigen test may give some false negatives. The PCR test is extremely accurate, is very specific. It uses the molecular platform, is basically making copies in a machine, making copies RNA copies of that molecule we want to measure, which is typically the RNA that codes for the spike protein. So that's very accurate. Now, some people ask the question, well, how do we know that this positive test is really detecting COVID and not flu? The reason is that COVID and flu are two completely different viruses. And the tests are designed to detect specifically one molecule of the virus that is unique to that virus. So the sequences we call primers that are being used to detect the COVID are unique to COVID. They're not present in flu. They're not present in other viruses. So that's why a PCR test is accurate and is specific for COVID. Won't detect flu, won't detect other viruses. The same that a test for flu won't detect COVID. And you can even, for the coronavirus and different types of coronavirus, you can have PCR tests that can detect the different variants of coronaviruses also. That's the accuracy of the molecular test.
Because I was going to ask that, with all these variants coming, you can still be doing the PCR. So, okay, that's good. Somebody's asked very specifically, which brand of vaccine is the safest from your experience?
You know, we always said the one that is available to you. Whatever vaccine is in your country that you can get, all the vaccines that have been tried so far, they all have over 50% efficacy against Delta, Alpha, some of the initial variants. More recently, the Pfizer Moderna boosters have been found to be efficacious in eliciting neutralizing antibodies to Omicron. So even when Omicron can evade the innate and the acquired immunity, still the boosters can make our immune system produce antibodies that neutralize the spike protein of Omicron. So far, the one that has the best documented safety record and effectiveness so far, maybe the Moderna. Pfizer also is pretty good. The Janssen & Janssen, the only problem with that is, as I mentioned, is the induction of thrombotic events in some individuals, rare events, but they do happen. We don't have a lot of data for some of the other vaccines. So the best studied are the Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. That's where the bulk of the data on efficacy and side effects is coming from. Some people have referred to the Moderna as the Rolls Royce or the Mercedes-Benz of the vaccines. I don't know. Whichever vaccine you can take to prevent severe disease, that's good enough.
Mm. And given the fact that it seems like we're going to have to keep getting boosters, somebody's asking, what can that have a detrimental effect on our health if you have to be taking boosters twice a year for the next 5-10 years? Can that be detrimental, just having to have boosters all the time?
Time will tell, but the experience that we have so far with the flu boosters is that having an annual flu booster doesn't have detrimental effects on our health. So, and there are other vaccines that also use boosters, not annually like the flu. So time will tell. I was reading a paper about what's the end game for the COVID virus. What people are predicting is that the COVID virus is going to be endemic in the future, that there's going to be outbreaks in different parts of the world. The worst case scenario would be a virus that had the transmissibility of Omicron with the fatality of either Delta or the first SARS virus that came in 2003. That would be a worst case scenario, which I hope doesn't happen. If it does happen, vaccines will basically be lifesavers, or other antiviral drugs that will be developed until then. So, and we don't know also how potent are these boosters in terms of inducing long-term T-cell immunity, because what we have studied so far is antibody immunity. When we talk about waning immunity, it's about B-cell mediated antibody immunity. But we have T-cells that are the masterminds of the immune system. These are the ones that control immune responses. And so far, the data indicates that T-cell responses that are elicited by the vaccines are long-lived. How long, we don't know. And I hope they are very long-lived. So we still, given the short time that we had to study this virus and the pandemic, we still don't know how long T-cell immunity will last after the boosters. And it could be years.
Okay. I think it was you, Dr. Castellano, that mentioned the ingredients in the vaccines. Someone's asking, do you think that everything has been publicly shared, or are there some secret ingredients like in Coca-Cola or something like that? Yeah.
No, if you look at the Centers for Disease Controls, all the ingredients are published there. What you don't find is how much of the ingredient in terms of micrograms, in terms of microliters, but all the ingredients have to be published. For a vaccine or a drug to be approved here in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration and be recommended by the Centers for Disease Control, all the ingredients have to be made publicly available. In terms of the rights for the company to not to disclose any of those ingredients, that doesn't happen. Typically, the intellectual property lies not on the ingredient, but on the platform, the technological platform that is used to make the vaccine, not on the ingredients themselves.
And talking about the platform, somebody was talking about, somebody asked a question about aborted fetal material being used in chains of how to make the vaccines. Are we moving into the area of ethics when scientists are using aborted material to develop these kinds of things? Does anybody have any?
Yeah, let me clarify that, because this is a misconception. In science, we use in the lab what is called established cell lines. For example, many of you may have heard about the HeLa cell line, and the HeLa cell line was established from a cervical tumor from an African-American woman, and HeLa stands for the initials for the name of the patient. And those cell lines have been established in labs and have been used for 50, 60, 70 years. And some of those cell lines are used for testing compounds, for producing vaccine components. Some cell lines, like the human embryonic kidney cell line and other cell lines that were produced in the 1950s and 60s, came from aborted fetuses at the time. And what it was done is that cell lines were created, these cell lines have been propagated, and the cell lines are used to test medications. Almost every single medication that we take, whether it's for blood pressure, whether it's for metabolic issues, for diabetes, for heart disease, every vaccine that we have has been initially tested in cell lines. is what is called in vitro models, because the way a medication or a vaccine is tested, we start in vitro with cell lines, then we move to animal models, then we move to humans. So these preclinical studies use cell lines that were established 50, 60 years ago, not all of them, but some of them from aborted tissues that were obtained with patient consent at the time. Let's say someone had a spontaneous abortion or some other induced abortion, and then the scientists approach the woman, could we have permission to use some of those tissues? Or at that time, even some of those tissues, if they were de-identified, there was no identification, they were allowed to be used in the lab. So these vaccines do not contain fetal tissues, but like other medications, like other vaccines, they were initially tested in cell lines that were generated in the lab that originally were derived, some of them from fetal tissues.
Okay.
May I add something to that?
Sure. Peter.
Thank you for a very, very comprehensive response on that. I do wish to add to it the question or the comment or the, dare I say, the accusation is that the Adventist Church is supporting abortion. That is most certainly not true. The Adventist Church does not condone abortion, and you can go and check the statement which is available, voted at a recent annual council on this issue. As has been mentioned, many lives are saved through the careful use of vaccines, and Seventh-day Adventists continue to advocate for vaccines to be produced ethically. We support the saving of life and the maintenance of herd immunity, as we've discussed today, through responsible vaccination practices. And it's been described that a huge price was paid in the early 1960s, and cells were obtained, as has been described. And various religions, such as the Roman Catholic Church and Judaism, have registered their disapproval of the initial harvesting process, but have nevertheless encouraged the use of vaccines among their adherents to prevent illness and to save life. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has clearly articulated its biblical stance on abortion. We also, though, encourage responsible immunization to save life and prevent illness. Having said that too, that these cells were obtained many years ago, a price has been paid. We nevertheless do support and gratefully support the outcome which has brought around the prevention of so many illnesses. Now, there's one thing that I don't know if everybody noted when Dr. Cassiano was talking. He talked about how many substances, pharmaceuticals, creams, and so on are tested on cell lines that are pre-existent and cultured. Mm. And there is a hospital in Arkansas that said that if it grants a religious exemption to its employees against the vaccines, those individuals have to forswear the use of a list of substances, including Lipitor, Tylenol, which is a pain medication, acetaminophen, Tums, Pepto-Bismol. There's a list as long as your arm. And we do need to realize that this is not a condoning of a practice. And it's it should not be seen just as much as the church has not walked away from basic health principles in disease prevention, nor is it embracing abortion under the current circumstances and in the current debate. And I just think that needs to be very, very clearly enunciated and understood.
Thank you. I think you're touching on something that a number of people have actually brought up, and that is really the whole area of confidence and trust. Somebody asked the question, can we trust governments that are pushing a vaccine that don't say anything about our health message? I know you did already allude to this, Dr. Landis, but maybe you can get into it again. Should we be trusting them, or should we be trusting what our Adventist health message has always been and just go in that direction?
It's not and please, colleagues, jump in by all means, but this is not an either or. What seems to have come, and there's a conflation of what is around on the Ethernet, the internet, conspiracy theories, which have come together and caused a significant confusion. We as a church continue to promote and to, I pray, live. And having worked in the World Church in health for a number of years, I'm sad to tell you that our church does not embrace the health message as it should, nor as it could. People may wish to debate that, and I'm happy to enter into that debate. We have statistics which show that. But we have a health message. We have a potent health message. We have a grace-filled, God-given health message, which we as church members should embrace. And it includes a graciousness. Do you know that the way that we work with one another, our social support to one another, the science is replete with the evidence that shows what positive, strong, supportive relationships does. The Bible talks about a merry heart does good like a medicine. Apart from the enumerated 8 natural principles, which are listed in Ministry of Healing, there are included, if you look what Ellen White writes about our relationships, our caring for each other, our integrity. People who have an integrity have a happier life. People who are religious and are spiritual have better health. So our health message is key and primary. In our mission statement, we talk about our church being to preach, to teach, to heal and nurture, part of the 4 foundational pillars of our church. So yes, embrace the health message. Then let's take the evidence which has been placed before us. Let's look at what has been encouraged in our church even since its inception. Let's jump back to the Old Testament of the instructions God gave to the Israelites and told them how to keep themselves clean, how to have laws of health, how to deal with their excrement, take it out and bury it. God has given instructions on appropriate public health methods. And then, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made, we see the benefits that immunization can bring to longevity and health in the big picture. And importantly, and it's been very encouraging to me to read what Ellen White's grandson reports about her emphasizing and stressing and saying to people, well, get the smallpox vaccine. She herself took it. Now, those are issues which, as we as a church look back to, the Bible, the spirit of prophecy, peer-reviewed evidence-based health science, all of these issues come together and bring what is sensibly, what I mentioned and summarized in my talk, the public health measures that increase longevity have been sanitation, clean water, and immunization. What a blessing we've had to understand that, and in the context of the Adventist health message, which is robustly supported by excellent health, peer-reviewed science.
Thank you. Jennifer Woods, that's all you have. Yeah.
To add to what Dr. Landis said, it's not a question of either or. Yes, we promote our health message. It is a blessing. We should be preaching the health message, but at the same time, we should also be submitting to government authorities as long as it's not conflicting with, obedience to God. That's biblical. And it's not saying that government authorities are perfect. They're made up of humans. And so, yes, there are imperfections there, but right now, this is a public health crisis. And at least as I see it, I don't see a conflict between what the government is saying we should be doing, which is to protect the public health around us, and our health principles. So I don't see this as being an either or.
Yes, I would like to add that the nature of the question, I think, has to be revisited also somehow, because should we trust government? The issue is not just about trusting government, because it is about also Seventh-day Adventists, like our experts, doctors, and so forth, who are making recommendations. It's not just about the government. And the government, I think it would be too sweeping to position the government as an adverse entity. And here, in some cases and countries, certainly, this has been the case. But we are talking about a situation very specific here about the health crisis. But I want to add another dimension also to our conversation. When we talk about government, maybe in this case, we could think about the policies, right? Because politics leads to policies, and people live through those policies and so forth, so on. And I think our approach to the international community, community, or even national policies and so forth, has, I think, a Christian twist to it. In our policies, we are expressing solidarity with our neighbors. Let me just give briefly a few examples without finishing with this idea, of the health policies. For example, policies should be expressions of our code of ethics. For example, how we treat the homeless, that talks about housing policies. How we treat migrant immigration policy. How we treat the poor, policy for government welfare social programs. How we treat the uneducated, education policy. How the government takes money from the poor, the rich, and those in between, tax policy. And we could continue talking about the budget, civil rights policies, et cetera, and also human rights policies. So we are part of all that. We engage governments, right? And the health policies today, the same thing. We have an added value. We add to it our Christian code of ethics of caring about our neighbor. And I think this is where the vaccination issue and policies about vaccination also should include that moral, ethical aspect. I can even say a moral imperative for us to care, and not only to care, but it is an expression of the love of our neighbor also. And I think we have to include this, not just putting, antagonism against government. Yes, it is justified when the government crosses a red line, or basically goes beyond its prerogative. And this is why I talked about checks and balances here, even within governments, and all the more citizens engaging the government also. I think we really need to think carefully about these things. Whatever we do as Christians should be expression of our code of ethics, of our valuing of what really matters to people and how we can care. So all these policies, including health policies. And again, the government, when they propose something, in many ways, it can be legitimate because based on science. And Adventists and other Christians and other religious people, religious actors, participate in this conversation.
Dr. Landless, I think you were going to say something as well.
I was on the track that we were talking about on our church history. You know, the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald has records of communications between our church and its missionaries in the 1930s, 1937, encouraging the use of the typhoid vaccine, the smallpox vaccine. And in 1957 as well, there's a letter which is using language which today would not be very well accepted. When I say language, the use of language, addressing a missionary who was resisting having his daughter vaccinated against diphtheria. And the comment was made by the author, which said, "You may take onto your broad yet ignorant shoulders the decision of refusing this immunization for your daughter, but when she dies, when you're on service, the consequences are real." And, you know, back before that, in 37, one of the letters says, it's very important to live the health message, but use the additional protection of immunization as well. And our missionaries around the world are largely, and still it's expected that our missionaries will be vaccinated according to the needs of the areas where they're going to be working. I would like to add one comment briefly. I see our time is running, but I would be remiss not to just point out something regarding Dr. Cassiano. Many people may not know him, but I just want to appreciate that we have an expert of this stature in the scientific field, not only because he's at Loma Linda, which is our flagship health education institution, but recognized in the world as an expert in immunology and his field. And I deeply, deeply value that an individual who was sourced and recruited from the Scripps Institute, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, has made this tremendous contribution. Of course, that doesn't downplay the contribution of the other members of this panel. But I do believe that it's important that the viewers understand the caliber of the information which he has shared today. Because it'll be said, well, you know, we can quote, there's a Dutch virologist who says this, and we can quote another outlier there. Well, sometimes I'm sad to use this very direct language that there are outliers, dare I say it, there are outright liars. And there could be the greatest of sincerity in sharing of some of the falsehoods which are going around. But I just want to appreciate when we have such valuable scientific material shared with us in and with integrity. My heart is thankful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Landless, and that really was what I was going to do here at the end, but you said it so very well. I'd like to thank all four of you for taking your time, for preparing, for taking the time to answer our questions here. It's been invaluable. We're really glad that we have this recording, and it will be put on our website afterwards. It will be immediately available on YouTube as well. Yes, Ganun. Just unmute and
I just wanted to very briefly add to what Dr. Landless said, and share a public apology to Dr. Cassiano, because I was literally persecuting him, to be part of this, and that is because I knew how valuable his participation. So I even called another person to trace him and all those things. So Dr. Cassiano, my apology, even though it is not repentance, because I'm glad you have joined us.
Yeah, no apologies, nothing to apologize for. I train as a scientist at the University of California in microbiology and clinical immunology at the Scripps Institute, and I had a thriving research career with NIH funding. And Loma Linda approached me to recruit me, and many of my colleagues at the Scripps Institute, at the Salk Institute, the Burham Institute in La Jolla, in San Diego, they told me that that I was gonna commit a professional suicide if I came to Loma Linda, because Loma Linda at the time was very strong clinically, very strong in teaching, and it was building a research program, NIH-funded research program. But I felt the calling. I felt this is a place where God was calling me. At the time, Loma Linda was recruiting a lot of young scientists, very promising scientists, and my career has blossomed here way beyond what I had imagined, way beyond what may had happened had I stayed in other places, and I have contributed to the field of cancer and autoimmune diseases at the international and national level, and still after 25 years at Loma Linda, still keeping some NIH funding for my research. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to share some of this knowledge. And I would like to do a final statement. As Adventists, we have a treasure in our health message.
Yes.
But the reality of the world we live in is that we have a genetic predisposition to diseases. And unfortunately, our healthy lifestyle, what it helps a lot to prevent chronic disease, sometimes may not prevent infections like that, the poliovirus, like the diphtheria toxin, like COVID, that is so unique in evading our immune system. That's why I echo Dr. Landler's comments that we need to have hand in hand our health message together with public health measures that complement each other. They don't antagonize each other. They complement each other. One goes hand in hand with the other, because as I read the scientific literature, I see so many cases of genetic traits that we have that may predispose us to develop severe COVID regardless of our lifestyle. Every day in the news, I see a young father, perfectly fit, with a healthy lifestyle, dying of COVID. A young mother, a child. I personally have lost 2 or 3 friends, Adventist friends with very healthy lifestyle to COVID, some in the 70s, some in the 30s. So we need to take our health message, blend it with these public health measures to save lives and continue the healing ministry of Jesus Christ.
Thank you very much. I think that's a fitting way to close our symposium here, and thank you, each and every one of you, for being with us today. And I'd like to thank you as our viewers as well for taking the time to follow this symposium. As I said, the recording will be available on demand later, so please do visit the Trans-European Division website and you will find it there. And you can go onto YouTube and it will be available there as well. May God bless you and help you as you continue to make good and healthy and wise decisions about your health and how to help others around you as well. Thank you all, and God bless you.
God bless.